In medieval Europe, leaders didn't just fight wars. They also tried to control weapons. Councils, kings, and city governments issued bans on things like crossbows, certain blades, and carrying arms in public, hoping to reduce bloodshed and keep order. The problem was that real life didn't cooperate. Armies needed whatever worked, towns couldn't police everyone, and people quickly found loopholes. In this video, we're breaking down the medieval weapon bans that sounded strict on paper, but failed in practice. Number 1. The crossbow ban. When people think medieval weapon bans, the big one that always comes up is the church trying to shut down the crossbow. In 1139, a major church council declared the crossbow, and often archery in general, off-limits when used against fellow Christians. The idea wasn't that the weapon was new. It was that it felt like a shortcut to killing. A knight could spend years learning mounted combat, armor use, and battlefield discipline, and then a foot soldier with a week or two of practice could threaten him from a distance. That wasn't just scary, it was socially disruptive, because medieval warfare was tied to status. Nobles were supposed to dominate the fight, and ransom culture depended on capturing elites alive, not simply dropping them where they stood. Crossbows also challenged the training model of the time. A strong longbow archer needed constant practice, and some kingdoms built national habits around that. A crossbow still took skill, but the mechanical draw meant power didn't rely on lifelong conditioning in the same way. That made it easier to hire specialists, especially for sieges, where disciplined shooting from cover mattered more than heroic charges. In several regions, professional crossbow corps became a real military asset, with towns and rulers paying for trained crews, spare strings, and steady supplies of bolts. So the ban ran straight into military reality.
Nobody could actually enforce a church-wide battlefield rule. Medieval Europe didn't have one police force, one army, or one legal system that could check every battlefield. Kings and city-states were the ones paying soldiers and buying weapons, and they cared more about winning sieges and battles than about moral statements. There were also built-in loopholes. The ban was usually framed around fighting other Christians, while frontier wars and crusades were treated differently, so leaders could claim they were respecting the spirit of the rule, even while keeping crossbows in service. Crossbows stayed incredibly practical in real conditions, compact on walls, useful on ships, and effective at the messy, close ranges of siege warfare where a lot of medieval fighting happened. By the time you get to big, set-piece battles like Crécy in 1346, hired crossbowmen were still part of the picture, even in wars between Christian kingdoms. So the ban mostly turned into a talking point, not a real limit. If a rule can't be monitored, can't be punished consistently, and clashes with what commanders believe works, it doesn't last long as an actual ban. Number 2. No swords in town. Once you step away from battlefields, the most common medieval weapon bans were about public order. Town governments and kings were constantly trying to stop street violence, feuds, faction fights, and sudden brawls that could spiral fast in crowded streets. That's why you see city ordinances that say, in plain terms, don't walk around armed, especially at night, in markets, or during big festivals when tempers ran hot. England's Statute of Northampton in 1328 is a famous example of this mindset. It targeted people going armed in public to the terror of others, and it was meant to back up the idea of the king's peace. But this kind of ban struggled for practical reasons. Medieval people carried blades as everyday tools. A knife wasn't just a weapon. It was for food, work, and travel. Status mattered too. A sword was a symbol as much as it was gear, and elites were rarely eager to give up the right to wear one. Some towns even singled out sword and buckler fighting culture,
because a small shield made street violence more likely to turn into a real fight instead of ending with harsh words. Then there's the biggest contradiction. The same towns that wanted calm streets also depended on armed citizens for defense. A medieval town might ban carrying weapons in taverns, then require households to show up with arms for militia duty when the alarm bell rang. So enforcement became selective. Watchmen could stop someone, fine them, confiscate a weapon, or lock them up for a night, but they couldn't search everyone all the time. Officials, nobles, guards, and respectable travelers got exceptions, and ordinary people learned the local rules: what you could carry openly, what you had to keep at home, and what you could get away with if you weren't causing trouble. The bans didn't remove weapons from the city. They just tried to control when and how weapons showed up, which is a very different goal. Number 3. Daggers that wouldn't disappear.
If you wanted a weapon ban that was nearly impossible to make stick, you'd pick the dagger. Medieval soldiers, including knights, carried them because close combat happens even in armored fighting. When armor is doing its job, long cuts don't matter much, and a short blade becomes a practical backup for grappling and last resort moments. In civilian life, daggers were cheap, common, and easy to hide. That made them a favorite target for local laws. Some towns tried to ban specific styles associated with trouble, like long-bladed baselards or stiff, narrow rondelle daggers. Officials would name the weapon, set a blade length limit, or ban carrying it after curfew. People adapted fast. If the law banned daggers, a maker could call it a knife. If the law banned a blade past a certain length, the handle got longer and the blade got shorter, keeping similar reach in use. If the law focused on open carry, people wore blades under a cloak or tucked them into a bag. And because daggers were also tools, anyone caught with one had an easy argument. It's for work, it's for eating, it's for travel. There's also a social angle. In many places, a blade was part of respectable dress, not just criminal gear. So outright bans ran into pushback from people who saw them as normal. Meanwhile, armies still wanted sidearms. In the Middle Ages, a lot of fighting was about endurance, control, and tight spaces. So a backup blade stayed useful no matter what a local ordinance said. The result was predictable. Dagger bans produced paperwork and fines, not a dagger-free society. And the exact shapes just kept evolving. Number 4. Hunting bans and the war on poaching. Some of the harshest medieval weapon restrictions weren't about war at all. They were about hunting. In many parts of Europe, elite hunting rights were protected by forest laws, and those laws often treated weapons as part of the problem. A bow or crossbow in the wrong hands wasn't just illegal gear. It was a threat to a whole system of privilege, food supply, and political control. That's why you see rules that limit who can own or carry hunting weapons in certain areas, who can hunt specific animals, and what kind of equipment counts as poaching. These bans didn't work cleanly, because the countryside is hard to police. Royal forests and lordly preserves were huge, local officers had limited reach, and communities often protected their own. For poorer people, illegal hunting wasn't always a hobby. It could be a survival strategy in a bad year, especially when prices rose or harvests failed. And the same weapon used for hunting could also serve in local defense, or in a lord's levy when war came. So even when laws tried to cut off access to bows, crossbows, or hunting arrows, demand stayed high. Instead of eliminating the weapons, hunting bans pushed them into hidden networks. Borrowing, sharing, black market sales, and quiet deals with craftsmen who, didn't ask questions. In that way, the law shaped who got punished, but it didn't stop the weapons from being owned or used, and it definitely didn't remove them from medieval life. Number 5. Polearms and dangerous gatherings. As medieval battles evolved, especially from the 1300s onward, infantry became more important, and that meant polearms everywhere. Bills, halberds, pikes, glaives. Different regions had different names, but the idea was simple. A long shaft with a blade or point was affordable, fast to produce, and effective in formation. For a medieval army, it was a way to put serious power into the hands of ordinary soldiers, not just knights. For town militias, polearms were often the standard issue because they were practical for guarding gates, forming a line, and pushing back cavalry. That created a political problem in peacetime. A street full of men with long weapons looked like a riot waiting to happen, even if they were just moving from one place to another. So towns wrote bans and restrictions. No carrying long weapons inside the walls, no bringing them into markets, no showing up with them at festivals, and definitely no marching around in groups. The catch is that the same towns still needed those weapons for defense, watch duty, and emergency musters. So the ban became conditional. People got permits, guilds had exemptions, guards were armed by definition, and militia members were expected to keep gear ready at home. When trouble hit, leaders suddenly wanted the exact weapons they had been limiting. In practice, the rule wasn't polearms don't exist. It was don't turn them into a show of force at the wrong moment. And that kind of rule is always full of loopholes. Number 6. Armor rules that kept flipping. Another category of medieval weapon bans was really about controlling military power, not one specific blade. Some rulers tried to limit who could own certain kinds of war kit, helmets, mail armor, lances, crossbows with heavy spanning gear, because bandits and private armies were a real threat. If local strongmen could arm a group of followers, they could ignore courts, extort communities, and turn personal grudges into mini-wars. So you see attempts to stop unauthorized musters, restrict sales, or ban exporting weapons and armor to enemies. Ports and border regions were especially sensitive because moving arms across a frontier could quickly change the balance in a regional conflict. But medieval states constantly undercut their own restrictions. In peacetime, officials wanted fewer armed men roaming around. In wartime, the same officials demanded that communities show up equipped. England is a clear example of this push and pull. There were moments when authorities cracked down on carrying arms in public, and other moments when they required households to keep arms for service. Across Europe, the same pattern shows up. A ban might exist on paper, but it's hard to tell a village to disarm and then, a month later, demand it provide soldiers with weapons for the campaign season. On top of that, weapons were durable goods. Armor and swords got inherited, resold, captured as loot, or passed down as family property. Once a region had a big stock of gear, banning it didn't make it vanish. It just changed who was allowed to show it openly and who got punished for having it. Number 7. Gate checks and the limits of enforcement. If you want to see medieval weapon control at its most practical, look at city gates. A lot of medieval bans worked less like a national law and more like a local checkpoint. Strangers coming in had to leave certain weapons with guards, declare them, or prove a reason to carry them. Towns feared traveling soldiers looking for work, mercenary bands between contracts, and armed retinues showing up to intimidate rivals. After major wars, groups of unemployed fighters could become free companies,
living off raids and protection money. Authorities sometimes tried to solve that by ordering disarmament, banning the carrying of crossbows or long blades by outsiders, or forcing people to store weapons rather than wear them. The weakness is obvious. Enforcement stops where the wall stops. Outside the gates, the same armed men still existed, and towns depended on trade and movement, so they couldn't lock down completely without hurting themselves. Inside the walls, gate rules were easy to dodge with bribery, with friends, or by entering through smaller routes. Weapons could also be broken down, wrapped, or moved as cargo, which made it harder to police without slowing commerce to a crawl. And because rulers themselves hired mercenaries, the line between illegal armed men and official troops could change overnight. When a duke or king needed soldiers, yesterday's band fighter became tomorrow's paid man-at-arms. So weapon bans aimed at outsiders often turned into a tool of politics. They hit the powerless hardest, while organized groups with patrons stayed armed. Number 8. Early guns and too new to allow. By the late Middle Ages, gunpowder weapons entered the picture, and they triggered the same cycle of fear and regulation. Early hand cannons and later handheld guns were noisy, unreliable, and genuinely risky to handle in tight urban spaces, especially with open flames and crowded wooden buildings.
Some towns tried to limit firing guns inside the walls, carrying them loaded, or using them during public events. These weren't just moral bans. They were also about fire risk, panic, and accidental damage. Still, bans couldn't stop the spread because leaders saw the military payoff. Even when early firearms were slow and awkward compared to bows, they had advantages commanders cared about. They could threaten armor, they worked well from behind cover, and they fit into siege warfare and defensive positions where raw punch mattered more than rate of fire. The same logic that kept crossbows alive, practical results, now helped guns move from suspicious novelty to normal equipment. Once rulers invested in artillery trains, powder supplies, and paid specialists, the legal approach shifted. Instead of pretending guns could be erased, governments moved toward control through licenses, storage rules, and supervised use. The weapon didn't disappear. It became part of the medieval army's toolkit, and the ban turned into regulation because that's the only model that matched how medieval war and politics actually worked.